The late-night gym sessions. Part 1. The first signs of change. It all started innocently enough. Emily had always been the kind of woman who took pride in her appearance. In her early 30s, with a demanding job and a husband who adored her, life seemed perfectly fine from the outside. But perfection, as she had learned, was an illusion. There was something missing, an emptiness that gnawed at her in the quiet moments. Restlessness, a subtle sense of dissatisfaction began to creep in, especially late at night, when her husband, Mark, fell into his usual deep sleep. That's when she started going to the gym. "It's my way to unwind," she told Mark one evening after he questioned the late hours. "Work's been stressing me out. The gym helps clear my mind." Mark, half asleep, nodded and grunted, pulling the blanket tighter around himself. He trusted her after all. They had been together for years, built a life on honesty, or at least that's what he believed. At first, the routine was nothing special. Emily would pack her gym bag after dinner, kiss Mark on the forehead, and drive to the local fitness center. The gym was practically deserted by 10 p.m., which suited her just fine. She liked the isolation, the space to herself. It was quiet, save for the hum of treadmills and the occasional clank of weights being lifted. The overhead lights were dim, casting long shadows in the far corners, adding an eerie calm to the place. But it wasn't the solitude that kept her coming back, night after night. It was Ryan. Ryan was her trainer. Tall, with a lean, muscular build, he had that rugged handsomeness that made women glance twice. His confidence was effortless, the kind of charisma that made people naturally gravitate toward him. They had started working together 6 months ago, back when Emily was just another client, but over time their relationship evolved. The boundaries between professional and personal grew increasingly blurred. At first, their sessions were standard: an hour of weights, cardio, stretches, followed by casual small talk about fitness goals and meal plans. But there was something in the way Ryan looked at her, the way his fingers would linger on her body just a second longer than necessary when adjusting her form. She noticed the warmth of his touch, the way his eyes traced her curves when he thought she wasn't paying attention. She told herself it was just her imagination, that Ryan was simply being a good trainer. But deep down, she knew better. It was during one of those late-night sessions that everything changed. Emily was working on her deadlifts, her body glistening with a light sheen of sweat. The gym was almost entirely empty, save for the two of them. Ryan was behind her, watching her form intently. He stepped closer, his breath warm on her neck as he whispered instructions. His hands, firm yet gentle, wrapped around her waist, guiding her into position. "That's it," he murmured, his voice low and intimate. "Feel the burn." Her pulse quickened. It wasn't the workout that made her heart race, it was him. The space between them seemed to shrink, the air thickening with an undeniable tension. She could feel his body heat through the thin fabric of her tank top. The weight of his gaze, the subtle brush of his fingertips, it was all too much. She exhaled sharply, trying to focus, but her thoughts spiraled in directions they shouldn't. It was then that she knew, this was no longer just about the gym. Ryan stepped back, his presence a magnetic pull even when he wasn't touching her. "You're doing great, Em," he said, flashing that easy smile of his. Her name, spoken so casually, sounded different coming from his lips, like a secret. "Thanks," she replied, forcing a smile, though inside she was anything but calm. Her muscles ached, her skin tingled, and her mind raced with possibilities she didn't dare entertain. Yet, she couldn't deny the thrill that coursed through her whenever she was near him. That night, after their session ended, Emily lingered in the locker room, staring at her reflection in the mirror. Her body had transformed over the past few months, toned legs, flat stomach, a new level of confidence in her appearance. But it wasn't just the physical changes she noticed. There was something else, something more dangerous. She wasn't just working out to relieve stress anymore. She was coming back for Ryan. As she packed her gym bag, Her hand brushed against something unfamiliar at the bottom. A pair of shoes, men's sneakers. Confused, she pulled them out, realizing they weren't hers, nor Mark's. They were Ryan's. He must have left them in her bag by accident after their last session. For a brief moment she considered calling him, returning them, but something stopped her. Instead, she shoved the shoes back into her bag and drove home in silence. Mark was already asleep when she got back. She slipped into bed beside him, careful not to wake him, her thoughts swirling. As she lay there, staring at the ceiling, she wondered how something so simple, late-night gym sessions, had spiraled into something far more complicated. And whether she could stop it, now that it had begun. Part 2. The Shift in Boundaries. The next few days passed in a blur of routine, but Emily couldn't stop thinking about the shoes in her gym bag. Each time she saw Ryan at the gym, it felt like they shared a secret no one else knew. She hadn't mentioned the shoes to him, nor had he asked. But the unspoken connection between them grew stronger with each passing session. The gym had become their sanctuary. The fluorescent lights, once cold and clinical, now seemed softer, casting a warm glow over the empty space. The rhythmic clanging of weights and the hum of exercise machines faded into the background as Emily and Ryan worked in sync. Their sessions were longer now, stretching well past the hour mark. And the touches, those subtle, lingering touches, became more frequent, more deliberate. It wasn't just the way he guided her movements, his hands firm on her waist or shoulders. It was the looks, the quiet, intense glances he shot her from across the room when she wasn't looking. The way his voice dropped lower when they were alone in the late-night silence. And the way her body responded, heart pounding, skin tingling, every fiber of her being attuned to his presence. One night, after an especially grueling workout, Emily collapsed onto a bench, catching her breath. Sweat glistened on her skin, her muscles burned, and her legs felt like jelly. She looked up to find Ryan standing over her, a bottle of water in his hand, offering it with a smile. "You're really pushing yourself," he said, his eyes traveling over her, lingering on the swell of her chest and the curve of her hips. She took the bottle, gulping down the water, her throat dry from exertion. "Just trying to keep up," she replied, her voice a little too breathless. Ryan chuckled softly, his hand reaching out to brush a strand of hair from her face. The touch was innocent enough, but the way he did it, slow and deliberate, made her pulse quicken. His fingers trailed along her jawline, leaving a faint burn in their wake. For a moment, neither of them moved. "It's not just the workout, is it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, but the question hung heavy between them. Emily swallowed, her heart racing. She knew what he meant, but admitting it out loud felt like crossing a line she wasn't sure she could come back from. And yet, she couldn't deny the way her body leaned toward him, craving more of those touches, more of his attention. She began, but the words died in her throat as he leaned down, his face inches from hers. "You don't have to say anything," Ryan murmured, his lips dangerously close to hers. The heat between them was palpable, electrifying, making her stomach twist in knots. He didn't kiss her, but the promise of it lingered in the air, tantalizing, torturous. She exhaled shakily, her breath mingling with his. "Ryan." He pulled back, just a fraction, enough to break the spell but not the tension. "I'll see you tomorrow," he said, his voice husky. And then, with one last smoldering look, he turned and walked away, leaving her sitting there, her pulse racing, her mind a chaotic mess. Emily sat there for a long time, trying to collect herself. Her body was still buzzing from the intensity of their near kiss, and her thoughts spiraled in directions she had tried to avoid for weeks. This was more than just attraction, this was dangerous. This was a line she had never thought she'd cross. But as the days went on, it became harder to resist. Every night she returned to the gym, knowing what was waiting for her, the stolen glances, the whispered instructions, the subtle touches that sent her heart racing. The guilt gnawed at her, but it was drowned out by the thrill, the excitement that came with every session. At home, Mark remained oblivious. He noticed the changes in her body, the new energy she carried, and complimented her on how amazing she looked. But the compliments only deepened the guilt, because she knew where that energy was really coming from. One evening, as she packed her gym bag, Mark walked into the bedroom, casually glancing at the open bag on the floor. His brow furrowed as he spotted something inside, a pair of sneakers much larger than hers. "Hey," he said, picking them up. "Whose shoes are these?" Emily froze, her heart lurching into her throat. "Oh, those," she stammered, scrambling for an explanation. "They're just an old pair I keep in the car, for when I forget mine." Mark gave her a look, his eyes searching her face for something. "They don't look like yours, they're pretty big." She forced a laugh, her nerves on edge. "Yeah, well, I bought them a size up just in case. You know how my feet swell after a workout." He didn't look convinced, but after a moment, he shrugged and dropped the shoes back into the bag. "All right, just seemed weird, that's all." Emily smiled, but inside, her mind was racing. Mark was suspicious, and the last thing she needed was for him to start asking more questions. As he left the room, she let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding, her heart pounding in her chest. The guilt twisted in her gut, but even that couldn't stop her from driving to the gym that night. Because despite everything, despite the danger and the lies, she couldn't stay away. Not from Ryan. Not from the intoxicating thrill of being near him. And as she pulled into the dark, nearly empty parking lot of the gym, a part of her knew that it was only a matter of time before something gave. Part 3. Crossing the line. That night, the air inside the gym felt different, charged, heavier than usual. Emily could sense it the moment she stepped inside, as though every shadow in the dimly lit room held a secret. Ryan was waiting for her near the squat rack, his arms crossed over his chest, a slight smirk playing on his lips. He looked relaxed, but there was an intensity in his eyes that sent a shiver down her spine. "Ready to go?" he asked, his voice low, almost teasing. Emily nodded, her heart already thudding in her chest. They started the session as usual, warm-ups, stretches, a few sets of weights, but tonight, everything felt heightened. Every touch lingered longer than it should, every look was more loaded. The space between them seemed to shrink with each passing moment. By the time they reached the last part of the workout, Emily's body was trembling, not from exhaustion, but from the tension that had been building all evening. They were alone in the far corner of the gym, away from the mirrors and machines, the only sound the steady rhythm of their breathing and the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Ryan stepped closer, his hand resting on her lower back as she bent over to grab a dumbbell. The contact was subtle, but it sent a jolt of electricity through her body. She straightened up, her pulse racing, and turned to face him. "You're doing great," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but there was something different in the way he looked at her tonight. Something hungrier, more dangerous. "Really pushing yourself." Emily swallowed hard, her throat dry. "Thanks," she managed, but the word felt hollow. The air between them was thick with unspoken tension, with a desire that had been simmering beneath the surface for too long. Ryan moved closer, his hand still on her back, his body inches from hers. She could feel the heat radiating off him, smell the faint scent of his sweat and cologne. Her mind screamed at her to step away, to put some distance between them, but her body betrayed her. She stayed rooted to the spot, her breath quickening as his fingers trailed down her spine, slow and deliberate. "Emily." His voice was soft, almost pleading, as his hand slid around to her waist, pulling her gently but firmly toward him. "You know there's something between us." She didn't say anything, but she didn't need to. The truth was in her eyes, in the way her body leaned into his, craving the contact despite the warning bells blaring in her mind. This was it. The moment where everything would change. The line they had been dancing around for weeks was right there, waiting to be crossed. And then, without another word, Ryan closed the gap between them. His lips were on hers before she could think, before she could second-guess herself. The kiss was urgent, filled with months of pent-up desire and frustration. Emily's body responded instantly, melting into him as his hands roamed over her back, pulling her closer. Her heart pounded in her chest, the world spinning around her as their lips collided, their bodies pressed together in the dim light of the empty gym. It was reckless, dangerous, and completely intoxicating. Ryan's hands moved to her hips, pulling her tighter against him, and she could feel the strength in his grip, the raw physicality of him. Her own hands slid up his arms, over the firm muscles of his shoulders, before tangling in his hair. Every touch was electric, every kiss sending shockwaves through her body. They stumbled back against the nearest wall, Ryan's breath hot against her neck as his lips moved down to her collarbone, kissing, biting softly. Emily's head spun with a dizzying mix of desire and guilt, but the guilt was quickly drowned out by the intensity of what she was feeling. She had never felt this alive, this wanted. But as Ryan's hands slid beneath her tank top, his fingers grazing the bare skin of her stomach, a small voice in the back of her mind screamed at her to stop. This was wrong. She was married. Mark. The thought of her husband's face, his trusting smile, flickered in her mind, cutting through the haze of desire. "Wait," she whispered, her voice barely audible as she gently pushed against Ryan's chest. Ryan pulled back, his breathing heavy, his eyes dark with lust. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice rough, his hand still resting on her waist. Emily hesitated, her heart racing, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. She wanted this. God, she wanted it so badly. But the reality of what she was doing, of what this meant, crashed over her like a wave. "I can't," she said, her voice trembling. I need to think." Ryan's jaw tightened, but he didn't push her. He stepped back, running a hand through his hair, his eyes searching hers. "I get it," he said quietly, though the frustration was evident in his voice. "But you know this is more than just a workout thing." Emily nodded, her chest tightening with guilt and longing. She knew it. She had known it for a long time. But acknowledging it out loud felt like opening a door she wasn't sure she could close again. "I just need some time," she said, pulling her tank top down, her hands shaking slightly. Ryan nodded, his eyes softening. "I'm not going anywhere, Em." She forced a smile, but inside, her emotions were a tangled mess. She grabbed her gym bag, avoiding his gaze as she headed for the door, her mind spinning with everything that had just happened. The cool night air hit her as she stepped outside, but it did little to clear her head. Her heart was still racing, her skin still tingling from Ryan's touch. She felt guilty, exhilarated, confused. As she slid into her car, she caught a glimpse of herself in the rearview mirror, her face flushed, her hair a mess, her lips slightly swollen from the kiss. She sat there for a long time, staring at her reflection, wondering how things had spiraled so far out of control. Wondering how she was going to face Mark when she got home. Part 4. Suspicion and Distance. The days that followed were filled with a tense silence, an unspoken distance that settled between Emily and Mark like a thick fog. She tried to act normal, to go about her routines without letting the weight of her guilt show, but it was impossible to shake the memory of Ryan's lips, his hands on her body. Every time Mark touched her, a casual brush of the hand, a kiss on the cheek, she felt a jolt of guilt so sharp, it nearly took her breath away. Mark, for his part, seemed blissfully unaware. But Emily could tell he sensed something had shifted. His eyes lingered on her more often now, watching her as if he was searching for something just out of reach. And then there were the questions, subtle at first, but growing more frequent. "You've been spending a lot of time at the gym," he remarked one evening as they sat at the dinner table. "Are you sure you're not overdoing it?" Emily forced a smile, pushing her food around her plate. "It's just been a stressful few weeks at work," she said, her voice too casual. "The gym helps." Mark nodded, but his gaze didn't waver. You know you can talk to me if something's bothering you, right? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Emily's stomach twisted, the urge to confess bubbling up inside her, but she swallowed it down. She couldn't tell him. She couldn't destroy everything they had built over one moment of weakness. I know, she said softly, her eyes flickering away from his. That night, as they lay in bed, Emily's mind raced with conflicting thoughts. She wanted to believe that she could fix this, that she could somehow turn back the clock and make everything right again. But the pull she felt toward Ryan was too strong, too consuming to ignore. Even when she wasn't at the gym, she found herself thinking about him. His voice, his touch, the way his body had felt pressed against hers. It was as if he had carved out a place in her mind, a place she couldn't escape, no matter how hard she tried. But Mark wasn't as oblivious as she had hoped. A few nights later, as Emily was getting ready for the gym, she noticed Mark watching her from the bedroom doorway, his arms crossed over his chest. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something that made her heart skip a beat. You're really dedicated to this gym routine, huh? He said, his tone casual, but his eyes sharp. Emily felt a knot of anxiety form in her stomach. Yeah, she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. I've made a lot of progress. I don't want to lose momentum. Mark didn't respond right away. He just stood there, watching her, his gaze drifting to her gym bag. And then, before she could stop him, he crossed the room and opened it, rifling through its contents. Emily's heart leapt into her throat as she watched him pull out a familiar pair of men's sneakers. Whose are these? He asked, holding them up, his voice calm, but his eyes blazing with suspicion. Her mind raced, scrambling for an explanation. They're just an extra pair I keep in case I forget mine. Mark's brow furrowed, his grip tightening on the shoes. These aren't your size, Emily. And they're definitely not mine. The air between them grew thick with tension, the unspoken accusation hanging heavily in the room. Emily's chest tightened, her pulse racing as she struggled to find the right words. I must have grabbed them by mistake, she stammered. Someone at the gym probably left them in the locker room, and I picked them up without thinking. Mark stared at her, his eyes hard, searching her face for any sign of deception. Are you sure about that? The silence that followed was unbearable. Emily could feel her heart pounding in her chest, the guilt gnawing at her insides. She knew he didn't believe her, not entirely. But he wasn't ready to confront her directly, not yet. After what felt like an eternity, Mark finally set the shoes down on the bed, his expression unreadable. All right, he said quietly, his voice devoid of emotion. Just be more careful next time. Emily nodded, her throat tight, relief and dread swirling inside her. She could feel the growing crack in their marriage, the fragile trust between them slowly unraveling. And yet, even after the close call, she couldn't stay away from Ryan. That night, as she drove to the gym, her thoughts were a tangled mess of guilt, desire, and fear. She knew she was playing with fire, that it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down around her. But the pull toward Ryan was too strong, too intoxicating to resist. The gym was quiet, as usual, the dim lights casting long shadows on the empty floor. Emily found Ryan in the back, lifting weights, his muscles taut and glistening with sweat. He flashed her a grin when he saw her, his eyes dark with the same desire that had consumed them both the last time they were alone together. Hey, stranger, he said, wiping the sweat from his forehead. Thought you might have been avoiding me. Emily forced a smile, but inside, her stomach churned with guilt. She wasn't sure what she was doing anymore, or why she kept coming back. But every time she saw him, every time he touched her, it was like a drug she couldn't quit. They went through the motions of their workout, but the tension between them was undeniable, the charged atmosphere crackling with unspoken desire. Ryan's touches lingered longer than they should have, his hands guiding her movements with a familiarity that made her heart race. As the session came to an end, they found themselves alone in the far corner of the gym, the weight of the night pressing down on them. Ryan stepped closer, his eyes locking onto hers, his breath warm against her skin. "You don't have to keep pretending you know," he said, his voice low, his hand brushing lightly against her arm. "We both know what this is." Emily swallowed hard, her pulse quickening. She wanted to deny it, to push him away, but the truth was she couldn't. There was no escaping what had already begun. "I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But it's complicated." Ryan's hand slid to the small of her back, pulling her gently toward him. "It doesn't have to be," he murmured, his lips hovering just above hers, the heat between them unbearable. Emily's breath hitched, her body betraying her even as her mind screamed for her to stop. But before she could make a decision, before she could act on the storm of emotions swirling inside her, Ryan leaned in, capturing her lips in a kiss that sent a surge of electricity through her entire body. And just like that, the line was crossed once again. Part 5. The Moment of Truth. Emily drove home from the gym that night with a strange, unsettling mix of emotions swirling inside her. The guilt gnawed at her like never before, but it was still eclipsed by the undeniable pull she felt toward Ryan. She had crossed the line again, maybe even for the last time, and this time there was no turning back. As she parked in the driveway and stepped out of the car, the cool night air wrapped around her like a heavy blanket. Her hands trembled slightly as she fumbled for her house keys, her mind racing with thoughts of what had happened at the gym. She couldn't keep doing this. Something had to give. When she opened the door, the house was quiet. Mark was already in bed, the soft glow of his bedside lamp casting long shadows on the hallway floor. Emily's heart tightened at the sight of him lying there, his back to her, the weight of their relationship resting heavily on her shoulders. She slipped into the bathroom, her reflection in the mirror catching her off guard. Her cheeks were still flushed from the workout, her lips slightly swollen from Ryan's kiss. She looked different. Not just physically. There was something in her eyes, a restlessness, a weariness that hadn't been there before. Emily undressed quickly, the cold tiles beneath her feet grounding her, and she slipped into bed beside Mark, careful not to wake him. But as she lay there in the darkness, her mind refused to quiet down. The kiss, the touch, the guilt, it all swirled together, making her stomach twist with anxiety. Mark shifted beside her, turning over to face her. His eyes fluttered open briefly, a soft smile tugging at the corners of his lips as he reached out to pull her closer. "You okay?" he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. "Yeah," Emily whispered, her heart breaking at the sound of his voice. "Just tired." Mark pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, his hand resting on her waist. "I love you," he murmured, before drifting back into sleep. Emily's chest tightened, the words sticking in her throat. She wanted to say it back. She wanted to feel it the way she used to, with the same certainty and comfort. But all she could think about was Ryan, his hands, his lips, the way he made her feel alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. The next few days were a blur. Emily tried to go about her routine, to keep things as normal as possible. But every time she looked at Mark, the guilt clawed at her insides, threatening to consume her. And yet, she couldn't stop herself from going back to the gym, from seeing Ryan, from indulging in the dangerous thrill of their secret encounters. But Mark wasn't as oblivious as she had hoped. One evening, as Emily was getting ready for yet another late-night gym session, Mark came into the room, leaning against the doorframe with a thoughtful expression on his face. "I was thinking," he said slowly, "maybe I could come with you to the gym tonight. We haven't worked out together in a while." Emily's heart skipped a beat, panic rising in her chest. "Oh," she stammered, struggling to keep her voice steady. It's kind of my thing, you know? My time to unwind." Mark nodded, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something she hadn't seen before. "I get that," he said. But we could do something together afterward. Grab a late dinner, maybe? Emily forced a smile, trying to hide the rising tension inside her. Sure, that sounds nice. As she headed to the gym that night, a sense of dread settled over her. Something felt off, and she couldn't shake the feeling that Mark was starting to put the pieces together. Her mind raced with thoughts of how she could keep him from finding out the truth, but no matter what she did, it felt like the walls were closing in on her. Ryan was already waiting for her at the gym when she arrived, his eyes lighting up as she walked in. But tonight, something was different. Emily was distant, distracted, her mind torn between the guilt of her betrayal and the intoxicating pull of what she had with Ryan. Everything okay? Ryan asked, stepping closer, his hand brushing lightly against her arm. Emily swallowed hard, forcing herself to smile. Yeah, just a lot on my mind. Ryan didn't press her, but his eyes lingered on her, the tension between them crackling in the air. They went through the motions of the workout, but it lacked the usual intensity, the usual fire that had driven them both to the edge so many times before. As the session came to an end, Emily glanced at the clock, realizing it was later than usual. She had promised Mark she'd be home soon, and the thought of him waiting for her, trusting her, made her stomach churn with guilt. I should go, she said abruptly, grabbing her gym bag and heading for the door. Ryan followed her, his brow furrowed in concern. Wait, he called after her, his voice filled with confusion. What's going on? But before she could answer, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, her heart sinking as she saw Mark's name on the screen. A text message. I'm outside. Thought I'd surprise you. Emily froze, her blood running cold. Her eyes darted to the gym entrance, and sure enough, through the glass doors, she saw Mark's car parked outside. He was there, waiting for her. Panic surged through her veins, her mind racing with the realization that everything was about to come crashing down. She could feel Ryan's eyes on her, could sense his confusion, but she couldn't think straight. She had to get out, had to fix this before it was too late. Emily. Ryan's voice was soft, but there was an edge of concern. Without another word, she turned and bolted for the door, her heart pounding in her chest. But as she pushed the door open and stepped outside, her worst fears were realized. Mark was there, standing next to his car, his eyes locked onto her. And then, he saw Ryan, following close behind her, his hand still lingering on the doorframe. For a split second, time seemed to freeze. Emily saw the look of realization flash across Mark's face, the understanding that everything he had trusted, everything he had believed in, was unraveling before his eyes. But instead of confronting her, instead of demanding answers, Mark did something that left Emily's heart shattered. He hesitated. For a moment he stood there, staring at her and Ryan, the pain etched deep into his face. And then, without a word, he turned, got back into his car, and drove away. Emily stood there in the empty parking lot, her heart breaking, the sound of Mark's car disappearing into the night. She had expected anger, a confrontation, something that would force her to face the consequences of her actions. But instead, he had walked away. And that, more than anything, was what broke her. What would you do if you saw your spouse getting too close to their trainer? Share your version of how the story should end in the comments.